Imagine for a moment, you're hiding, afraid, feeling too small for anything big. Now imagine God looking directly at you and calling you a mighty man of valor. Sound impossible? That's exactly how one of the most extraordinary stories in the Bible begins. Today, we'll delve into the life of Gideon, an ordinary man who discovered that God has a specialty, transforming fear into courage, weakness into strength, and ordinary people into extraordinary heroes. This isn't just the story of Gideon overcoming fear. It's living proof that God's purpose in your life can be far greater than your fears. Along this journey, I'll reveal a surprising detail about how God confirmed his victory before the battle even began. Something that could completely change your perspective on the challenges you face today. Get ready, because the story of Gideon in the Holy Bible is about to touch your soul in ways you never imagined. There are moments in history when darkness seems to have completely won. Israel was living one of those moments. For 7 long years, the Midianites had transformed the Promised Land into a nightmare of terror and devastation. It wasn't just a military occupation. It was a systematic extermination of hope. Imagine the scene: entire families hiding in caves, children growing up without knowing a day of peace, crops being destroyed at the very moment of the joy of harvest. The Midianites came not just as enemies. They came like locusts in countless hordes, devouring everything in their path. It was an oppression that attacked not only the bodies, but also the souls of God's people. The people who had once conquered Jericho with shouts of victory now whispered desperate prayers in damp, cold hiding places. Where was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Where were the miracles their fathers had told around campfires? Faith seemed to have been buried under the weight of brutal reality. But it is precisely in these moments of greatest despair that God prepares his greatest interventions. When all seems lost, when heroes have gone into hiding and courage has become legend, the Almighty seeks someone ordinary, someone unlikely, someone who doesn't even believe in themselves. And that was exactly how God's eyes fell upon a frightened young man hidden in a winepress, trying to save a handful of wheat. But who was this man? And why would God choose him for an impossible mission? The scorching midday sun mercilessly beats down on the valley where Gideon works. Sweat mixes with dust as he threshes wheat at the bottom of the winepress, a completely unsuitable place for this task, but the only one that offers protection from enemy eyes. His hands tremble not only from the physical exertion, but from the constant fear that has become his inseparable companion. The surroundings are desolate. Once golden fields now resemble open scars in the earth, fruit trees broken by invaders, and a heavy silence that screams the absence of children playing. Gideon stops for a moment, wipes away the sweat, and looks around with a heavy heart. "We are the smallest clan in Manasseh," he thinks, "and I am the least in my father's house." The feeling of insignificance seems greater than the mountains surrounding the valley. Suddenly, a strange shadow cuts through the sunlight, a presence that makes the air vibrate with power and holiness. The angel of the Lord appears before him, and his first words sound impossible. "The Lord is with you, mighty man of valor." Gideon nearly drops the implement from his hands. Valiant? He who hides to grind wheat. He whose name means cutter, but who has never cut anything but grain. The irony is almost cruel, but there's something in this heavenly figure's eyes that makes Gideon realize a profound truth. God isn't calling him for who he is, but for who he can become. The creator of the universe doesn't just see the frightened man in the winepress, he sees the liberator within, waiting to be awakened. But how could someone so ordinary be chosen for something so extraordinary? The answer was about to shake everything Gideon believed about himself. If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Gideon's question echoes through the valley like a cry from the heart of every person who has ever felt abandoned by God. It's not just doubt, It's the despair of someone who grew up hearing about miracles that seem to have ceased in the previous generation. Fear had become more than an emotion in Gideon's life. It was a stronghold that imprisoned him. Fear of failure, fear of not being enough, fear that God had deceived him. "O my Lord," he responds to the divine call, "with what shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is the poorest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." Every word reveals a deep wound in this man's soul. He can't see beyond his limitations, can't hear beyond his fears. It's as if he's looking at himself through a lens that only magnifies his weaknesses and obscures his possibilities. The boy who once dreamed of being a hero had been replaced by an adult who believed himself to be just another loser. But there's something powerful in this moment of admitted weakness. Gideon isn't pretending to be strong. He's being honest about his fears, and it's precisely this honesty that God can use. The Almighty doesn't need perfect people. He needs people willing to be transformed by His presence and power. God's answer is simple and devastatingly powerful. "Surely I will be with you." These aren't just words. It's a promise that spans centuries and still resonates in the hearts of everyone who feels too small for God's dreams. But is a promise enough to overcome decades of insecurity? Gideon needed more than words. His heart yearned for tangible proof that God had truly chosen someone like him. "Show me a sign that it is you speaking to me," he asks, with the humility of someone who recognizes his limitations, but also with the courage of someone who wants to believe. What happens next is one of the most moving moments in the Bible. Gideon prepares an offering, a young goat and unleavened bread, and places it on a rock. When the angel of the Lord touches the food with the tip of his staff, fire rises from the rock and completely consumes the offering. The sign is indisputable, supernatural, impossible to fabricate or imagine. But Gideon's faith still wavered like a flame in the wind. Later, he needed another sign, the famous test of the fleece, first asking for the dew to wet only the fleece and leave the ground dry, then the opposite. Some may question Gideon's lack of faith, but God, in His infinite patience, granted both requests. Taking advantage of this moment of reflection on God's patience, how about liking this video and subscribing to the channel? That way, you won't miss any of these life-changing stories. What moves God's heart is not our strength, but our sincerity. He knew Gideon needed these signs not because of distrust, but because the mission ahead was so great that it required unwavering faith. God was investing in His servant's trust, preparing him for even more challenging times to come. Each sign was a building block in Gideon's faith, a divine confirmation that the impossible was about to become reality. But before the external battle, there would be an internal war that Gideon would need to win. Gideon's first mission would not be against the Midianites, it would be against idolatry in his own home. God instructed, "Tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on top of this stronghold." The test was deeper than it seemed. It wasn't just about breaking statues. It was about breaking family traditions, confronting his own father, defying an entire community. Gideon would have to choose between pleasing men or obeying God, between the comfort of conformity and the courage of transformation. The decision was made at night. With 10 servants at his side, Gideon demolished the pagan altar and built a new altar to the true Lord. The sound of falling stones echoed in the darkness like a declaration of spiritual war. It wasn't just wood and stone being broken, it was chains of generations being broken. When day breaks, the entire city discovers what has happened. The revolt is immediate and violent. "Bring us your son so he can die," the men of the city shout to Gideon's father. But something surprising happens. Joash, the father, defends his son. If Baal is a god, let him fight for himself. It was at this point that Gideon received a new name, Jerubbaal. Let Baal contend with him. The man who had begun hiding in the winepress now had his identity publicly tied to his faith. Fear had been replaced by a courage he hadn't even known he possessed. But the true test of his new identity was about to arrive, and it would be far greater than anything he could have imagined. 32,000 men answered Gideon's call to war. It was a respectable army, but still small compared to the hordes of Midianites that covered the valley like swarms of locusts. Any general would be concerned about such a numerical disadvantage, but God had other plans. "There are many people with you," the Lord said to Gideon. "Many people for a seemingly impossible war." Divine logic defies all known military strategy. God did not want Israel to think they had won by their own strength. The glory should be His alone. The first reduction was brutal. All who were afraid were allowed to return home. 22,000 men left immediately. Imagine the psychological impact. Nearly 3/4 of the army gone in a matter of minutes. Gideon's heart must have sank as he watched so many men walk back to their homes. But God wasn't finished. The remaining 10,000 were led to the river to drink. Those who knelt to drink were dismissed. Only 300 men, those who raised the water to their mouths with their hands, remaining alert, were chosen. 300 against thousands. It was mathematically impossible. What God was teaching Gideon transcended military strategy. It was a lesson in total dependence, in trusting in divine power when all human resources are exhausted. The 300 men were not the strongest or most courageous. They were simply chosen by God to demonstrate that He can do much with little. That night, as he looked out over his small army against the sea of enemies in the valley, Gideon needed one last confirmation that God would indeed do the impossible. "If you are still afraid to go down, go with your servant Purah to the camp," God said to Gideon. It wasn't a rebuke, it was understanding. The Creator knew his servant's heart and knew he needed one last dose of encouragement before the decisive battle. In the darkness of night, Gideon and Purah descended silently to the edge of the Midianite camp. What they saw was terrifying. Tents stretched across the valley like grains of sand, countless camels, warriors armed to the teeth. It was a sea of enemies that made Gideon's 300 men seem like a drop in the ocean. But then, something extraordinary happened. They heard a Midianite soldier telling a dream to his companion. "Behold, I dreamed a dream, and behold, a loaf of roasted barley bread rolled through the camp of the Midianites, and came even unto their tents, and smote them, and overturned them from top to bottom." His companion's interpretation made Gideon's heart race. "This is nothing but the sword of Gideon son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has delivered the Midianites and all this camp into his hand." His own enemies were prophesying his defeat. At that moment, something completely broke within Gideon. The fear that had haunted him since childhood, the insecurity that had defined him, all dissolved before this revelation. He prostrated himself in worship right there, in enemy territory, because he finally understood that victory was already assured by God. When he returned to the Israelite camp, his words echoed with an authority he had never possessed before. "Arise, for the Lord has given the host of Midian into your hand." The transformation was complete. The frightened man had become the leader God had always known he could be. Gideon's battle strategy defied all known war manuals. Each of the 300 men was given a trumpet, a torch hidden inside a clay jar, and instructions that seemed crazy. Surround the enemy camp at midnight and, at the signal, break the jars, blow the trumpets, and shout. There were no swords, no spears, no horses, just 300 men armed with faith, obedience, and the certainty that God fulfills His promises. They divided into 3 groups and positioned themselves around the valley where the Midianites, Amalekites, and all the peoples of the east slept. At midnight, the signal was given. The silence of the night was rent by the deafening sound of 300 trumpets, the crash of 300 jars breaking simultaneously, and the battle cry that echoed across the mountains. "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." Torches flared in the darkness like stars falling from heaven. The effect was devastating. The Midianites awoke in utter panic. thinking they were surrounded by a vast army. In the confusion and terror of the night, they began attacking one another, unable to distinguish friend from foe. God himself had turned their strength against them. The victory was so complete it seemed unreal. An uncountable army was destroyed by 300 men who didn't even fight in the traditional sense. They simply obeyed, and God did the rest. The battle that should have been the slaughter of Israel became the greatest triumph in Gideon's history. But perhaps the most important part of this victory was not the defeat of the Midianites, but the discovery that God can use anyone willing to trust him completely. After their crushing victory, the people of Israel had an understandable reaction. They wanted to make Gideon their king. "Rule over us, both you and your son's son," they pleaded, "because you have delivered us from the hand of the Midianites." It was a tempting offer: power, prestige, a dynasty that would last for generations. But Gideon's response revealed that his transformation had been complete and profound. "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." These words show a man who finally understood that he had been merely an instrument in God's hands, not the hero of the story. The man who began hiding in the winepress ended up rejecting earthly power because he had discovered something much greater: his eternal purpose. Gideon understood that his greatest victory was not defeating the Midianites, but discovering who God had called him to be. He didn't need a crown to validate his identity. For 40 years, the land enjoyed peace under Gideon's spiritual leadership, not as king, but as servant, not dominating, but guiding. The true measure of a leader is not the power they accumulate, but the legacy they leave. And Gideon's legacy was to show that God specializes in transforming cowards into heroes of faith. Her story became an eternal testament that the magnitude of our fears does not determine the magnitude of our destiny, that our insignificance does not define our importance in God's eyes, that when we say yes to God's purpose, He transforms our weakness into extraordinary strength. But what can this ancient story teach us today? How can Gideon's experience impact your life now? Perhaps right now you identify more with the Gideon of the winepress than with the Gideon of victory. Perhaps you too are hiding from your dreams, from your fears, from opportunities that seem too big for you. Gideon's story is a bridge between who you are today and what God has dreamed for you. The God who called Gideon a mighty man of valor when he felt like a coward is the same God who looks at you today and sees potential where you see limitations. He isn't waiting for you to become strong before calling you. He's calling you to discover the strength that already exists within you through Him. Every "I can't" you whisper, every "I'm too small" that echoes in your mind, every "my family is humble" you use as an excuse. Gideon said all of these too, and God turned every limitation into an opportunity to display His power. Your weaknesses are not disqualifications, they are invitations to experience divine strength. Gideon's most powerful lesson is not that we should be brave, but that we can trust a God who is brave for us. It's not that we should be strong, but that we can rest in the strength of the Almighty. God's purpose in your life doesn't depend on your being perfect, it depends on your being obedient. As promised from the beginning, here is the special revelation. Even before the battle began, God had already planted in the dreams of the enemies the prophecy of Gideon's victory. Likewise, even before you face your giants, God has already decreed your victory. Your battles are not to determine whether you will win, they are to reveal that you have already won in Him. Today, the Lord looks at you and says, "Surely I will be with you." This is not just an ancient story. It is a current promise, a declaration of war against every fear that has kept you from fulfilling the purpose for which you were created. Gideon's journey teaches us that God doesn't look for perfect people. He looks for willing hearts, not people without fear, but people who choose to obey despite fear. Not the most qualified, but the most willing. If you're watching this video, Perhaps it's because God is preparing you for your own story of transformation. Stop for a moment and reflect. What winepress represents your comfort zone today? In what area of your life have you been hiding for fear of not being enough? What altars of idolatry, be they fear, insecurity, or conformity, need to be torn down in your personal life? The God of Gideon continues to call ordinary people to extraordinary purposes. Like Gideon, you can ask God for signs when your faith wavers. Like Gideon, you can start with a small act of obedience. Like Gideon, you can discover that your greatest enemy is not outside, but within, and that victory begins when you allow God to transform your fear into unshakable faith. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment telling us what moment impacted you most. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss other biblical stories that can transform your life. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that God specializes in using ordinary people for extraordinary things. Remember, the same voice that said, "The Lord is with you, mighty man of valor," to Gideon, whispers to your heart today, "Surely I will be with you." Your story of victory begins when you choose to believe not what you see in yourself, but what God sees in you. Divine purpose awaits your decision to step out of the winepress and embrace the destiny He has prepared especially for you. In Christ, you are not defined by your limitations, but by the unlimited power of the One who called you. May Gideon's courage inspire you to take the next step toward your eternal purpose.